Good morning. Most times I like to start off with, a funny story or something kind of silly. Today I can't exactly do that with this subject. This is because in the U.S., currently today, where we live, including the city where we live, approximately 100,000 to 300,000 youths are trafficked and sexually exploited per year, each year, any given year. You may say, well, that looks like a pretty big range. That's because, for obvious reasons, it's hard to get really good data on this particular subject. Part of how this is done is by blackmail. Blackmail via sexting is a common tactic used to entrap teenagers, to enslave teenagers. If you don't know what that is, sending compromising texts or images over the phone. And the goal here is a predator will engage a young person with this, get them to send compromising texts and photos, and then turn around and say, if you don't do what I say, I will spread this to everyone and everywhere. And so the young person, for good reason, fearing the reprisals of this, can be entrapped. In fact, when dealing with the subject of sexual exploitation and slavery, we have industries with direct links to it in our country, in our town today. These include strip clubs, prostitution, and pornography. And these things are not on the fringes of society. They are not far outside the mainstream. We have a man in Nevada who just won a political primary who openly owns legalized strip clubs and brothels. And he won with the help of so-called evangelical voters, so-called Christian voters. This is not a subject we can ignore because these things are not and never have been harmless. And so as we've been talking for the last several weeks, and we'll continue talking about some subjects that are uncomfortable over the next few weeks, if we're going to deal with the world as it is, if we're going to deal with our nation as it is, if we're going to deal with our city as it is, then we must deal with the subject of the gospel and sexual slavery. Last week we talked about the gospel and comfort. Welcome to the uncomfortable side. Especially for me. I'll just say that up front. We're going to start in the book of Exodus. And we're going to start in chapter 21, verses 26 and 27. And this is just after God has given the Ten Commandments. And as he gives further laws concerning how they deal with people, he says, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he will let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. And in this context, God is dealing with slavery in the ancient world, and especially in Israel. Servanthood or slavery was usually a temporary fixture that usually had to do with debts owed. Not in every case. Israel made some mistakes there too, but usually, in general, this would be as if I borrowed $10,000 from Ed. He's not going to let me borrow $10,000, apparently. But if I can only pay $5,000 back, then I would have to be his servant or slave until I worked off that other $5,000. That's the general thrust of what they usually encounter. But here, God denounces physical abuse in reference to servanthood, because God expected people to be treated without abuse. This is the expectation of God's people, that they will treat others well, that they will treat others without harm, without abuse. Earlier on in this same chapter, in verse 16, God speaks about a different kind of slavery. He says, "He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death." God does not stutter here. You see, this is what we in the modern world usually think of as slavery. This is the type of slavery that existed in the early United States, where people would kidnap people, take them somewhere else, and sell them to someone else. In the Old Testament, this is punishable by death of both the buyer and the seller. So if you're the kidnapper and you steal someone, you're put to death. If you say, "Yeah, I'll pay you $50 for them," you're put to death. God takes this subject seriously. I think we can agree that if God prescribes the death penalty for something, that he takes it very seriously. Are we correct here? This takes us back then to what we were just talking about. Because if you remember, I started off talking about some industries with direct links to sexual slavery, because slavery and sexual slavery exists today where we live. In our city, in this state, in this country. It exists underground across the world today. And I cannot think of any country connected to a mainland that is immune to this. There's probably some island nation out in the middle of nowhere that doesn't have this issue. That's not most of the world. And that's not where we live. As I said, this is not on the fringes. This is not on the outskirts of society, far removed from where we are. We have several strip clubs in Rockford. Some of them owned by people who claim to be Christians. There is a news report. Excuse me. I cannot remember the name of which one it was. But the reporter came to the man who owned it and said, "Well, you're a churchgoer, but you also own strip clubs. How do you deal with that inconsistency?" He says, "Well, business is business and religion is religion, and those two don't meet in my life." If you've been here more than like a month, you've heard me talk on this. I talk about it all the time. That there is no part of life that is compartmentalized away from the faith. doesn't exist. And someone saying that they're a follower of Christ doesn't make them such. We have issues with prostitution in this town. Craigslist is one of the number one sources currently for prostitution, because it's really easy. We also have a multi-billion-dollar industry in pornography. It is nearing omnipresence in our current society, and I'm not exaggerating. When I was junior high-ish, kid had snuck some magazines from his dad, and we found them. That was about as far as it went. It's not like that today. "2017 statistics." These are updated from the ones that I talked about last year. I usually talk about this subject at least once a year, because we need to. And this is a single largest site, okay? This is from one site. This does not include statistics from literally the millions of other sites involved in pornography. I want you to understand this is the one single biggest site, okay? Okay? They average 81 million daily visits from unique devices. One site. 81 million average daily visits. They put out 118 gigabytes per second of high-definition video. Let's put this in perspective, in case you don't know just how much this is. 118 gigabytes will hold almost 5 full-length movies. This amount of content is being, the equivalent of 5 full-length movies is being consumed per second on average. And my favorite statistic, my least favorite statistic, in case you didn't catch the sarcasm, the single most popular day of the week to watch is Sunday. You better believe they track this. There's a lot of other statistics that I'm not going to go into because it gets real weird. And in the United States, this is the statistic that should terrify you more than any. Because in the United States, 83% of visitors come from a mobile device, a smartphone or a tablet. 83%. Access through a phone or a tablet. You know why? Small, portable, easily hideable. I've heard from kids in high school now that there are kids that they go to school with watching it during class. When I say nearing omnipresence, I mean nearing omnipresence. And statistically, I'm not going to count you off. Statistically, 50 to 60% of the men in churches watch either weekly or monthly? Before before you say, ooh, 20 to 30% of women and growing. It is the fastest growing target market is women right now. And this is across all age groups. Those numbers get smaller as age goes up. Those numbers near 80 to 90% when we get to young men watching weekly. Do you remember what we said about these industries? That they have direct links to sexual slavery. Not that they kind of change the culture so people are more okay with it. Not they make people not really think about it too much. No, we're talking about directly involved, directly linked to sexual slavery. This is what we're talking about. People being entrapped and forced to perform on video. People being entrapped and forced to perform at a strip club. People being trapped and forced into prostitution. We're talking direct links, okay? So let's turn to 1 Timothy chapter 1. We're actually going to start in verse 8 instead of verse 10. And Paul writes to Timothy, "But we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. Knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, for the unholy and the profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for fornicators, for sodomites, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust." The word here that we're looking at specifically is kidnappers. And it is my understanding that in the original language, this word is really geared towards kidnapping someone in order to make slaves of. I have stolen a person to sell as property, to use as property. And they're tied in with the ungodly, with the unholy, with the profane, with murderers, and every other thing contrary to sound doctrine. Man stealers and slave stealers, sellers are thoroughly condemned by Paul here. Again, I don't believe that he is stuttering as he's writing this. But as we just mentioned, strip clubs, prostitution, and pornography and the viewing of it actively promotes sexual slavery. We have a push in this country to make prostitution legal across the nation. Like I said, we have a strip club brothel owner who just won a primary in Nevada. And we have the near omnipresence of pornography itself. You might say, well, I'm never going to go to a strip club. That's ridiculous. I'm not going to hire a prostitute. You crazy? But pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry with its tentacles in every single organization in the nation. So we have to ask the question, will God hold guiltless those who accept pornography and by extension, sexually enslaving others? as a way of life. And something okay, it's not a big deal, it's just a click. What we have to understand is that every click is more money sent. Every click is more ad revenue gained. Every click is a ranking up in the statistics. Every click is saying, this is okay. These are the stakes. These are the stakes. When 81 million people visit one site, these are the stakes. When 5 movies worth of pornography is consumed per second on one site, these are the stakes when people of God say, well, it's just a click. Because every click says that person being enslaved isn't a big deal. And every click says, I accept sexual exploitation and slavery. It's not just a click. It's never been just a click. And it doesn't just enslave the person on the other side of the screen. Romans chapter 6, verses 15 through 23. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? Certainly not. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one's slaves whom you obey? Whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness. But God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. And having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. I speak in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. For just as you presented your members as slaves of uncleanness, and the lawless leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves of righteousness for holiness. For when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. What fruit did you have then in the things of which you're now ashamed? For the end of those things is death. But now, having been set free from sin and having become slaves of God, you have your fruit to holiness, and the end, everlasting life. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. We are slaves to what we obey. Make no mistake here. See, sexual slavery does not just enslave others. It enslaves you when you join in. I can't tell you how many people I have known and dealt with and talked to who are slaves to this. Who struggle with this, who fight against it. Every study shows that it is just as addictive as hard drug use. It is just as addictive as heroin, crack, you name it. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33 and 34, Paul asks, or answers a good question. He says, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. Awaken to righteousness and do not sin, for some do not yet have the knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame, he writes to the Corinthians. So we have to ask, what company do you keep? Who or what do you spend time with when nobody else knows what's going on? When the screen is turned, when no one's around, when you're by yourself, so to speak. These questions have to be answered. See, this is the choice before us. The choice is, will we fight evil and atrocity? Or will we be an accomplice in it? Will we be complicit in it? If I willingly hand someone the tools to commit a murder, I'm an accomplice to that murder, right? I'm not going to make some friends with this next statement. Yeah, I'm going to say it. I think I have to. So you know, this makes me really nervous. If you hand your child a smartphone, and they use that to become entangled in sexual slavery from one side of the screen or the other, you are complicit in that slavery. Let's be very plain here. I've avoided this subject for literally years now because I really don't like it. Statistics show that 80 to 90, closing in on 90+% of young men in high school, college, junior high, and even late elementary are hooked on pornography once a week to once a month. For young women, that number is roughly 40 to 50% and rapidly growing, if you don't count sexting. You hand your child a smartphone, say, go have fun, enjoy this thing, and they are then hooked on pornography, you are complicit in that sexual slavery. That brings me no pleasure to say whatsoever. I feel that we must speak the truth, because if we do not, then we are not fighting evil and atrocity, and we buy into the world's idea that, well, this doesn't hurt anybody. We know the truth. You now know the statistics. You now know the truth. You now know how widespread the problem is, what it does, what it means, and the stakes involved in it. And we must act on it or be complicit in it. We have organizations in this city that fight tooth and nail against sexual exploitation and slavery. Things like Sonia's House in Rockford, the Rockford Area Against Sexual Exploitation, RAASE. who are constantly going out helping people trapped in this, educating our community about this subject, raising money to fight against it. There are places here in this city who are actively fighting against it. There are resources that we have access to learn about this subject and how we can be involved and how we can help. I encourage you, I implore you to look into them, to see what you can do. We'll say this at the end of this series as well, but I'll say this here. This will not be the calling for every person sitting here to get heavily involved in this. This is a very dark subject when you start getting into helping people, and it's not for everyone. But I can guarantee you, we have 150 here this week. There are some people here called to go out and get involved and help those who are suffering from this subject. I encourage you, now that you know the truth, to act on it and to fight the evil and the atrocity that threatens us, that threatens our children, that threatens our parents, that threatens our community, our city, our state, our nation, and our world. This goes far beyond the walls of this building. And we are called to be light and salt to this world. We're not going to do that if we blind ourselves and ignore it. So I encourage you to stand up, to educate yourself, to confess if you have something to confess, to ask for forgiveness, to make yourself accountable to others so they can help you out of this. As you said, this is addictive as drugs. Any drug out there, this is right up with it. And chances are you can't do it on your own. We need help, we need accountability, we need the Spirit of God. And trust in Him to lead us forward and out of it so we can be the salt and light that He calls us to be. Won't we do so? While we stand, while we sing.